Paddington Bear. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Brown were standing in Paddington Station. They were waiting for their daughter Judy, who was coming home from school. Suddenly, Mr. Brown noticed something small and furry behind a pile of mailbags. "Look over there," he said to Mrs. Brown. "I'm sure I saw a bear." "A bear?" said Mrs. Brown. "On Paddington Station? Don't be silly, Henry, there can't be." But there was. It had a funny kind of hat, and it was sitting all by itself on an old suitcase near the lost property office. As they drew near, the bear stood up and politely raised its hat. "Good afternoon," it said in a small, clear voice. "Can I help you?" "We were wondering if we could help you," said Mrs. Brown. "Wherever have you come from?" The bear looked round carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I stowed away and I lived on marmalade." Mrs. Brown spied a label round the bear's neck. It said simply, "Please look after this bear. Thank you. Aunt Lucy." "Henry," she exclaimed, "we shall have to take him home with us." "But we don't even know his name," began Mr. Brown. "We'll call him Paddington," said Mrs. Brown, "because that's where we found him." Mrs. Brown went off to look for Judy, and Mr. Brown took Paddington into the buffet for something to eat. He left Paddington sitting at a corner table near the window. He soon returned carrying 2 steaming cups of tea and a large plate piled high with sticky cakes. After his long journey, Paddington felt so hungry and thirsty, he didn't know which to do first, eat or drink. "I think I'll try both at the same time if you don't mind, Mr. Brown," he announced. And without waiting for a reply, he climbed up onto the table. Mr. Brown stared out of the window, pretending he had tea with a bear at Paddington Station every day of his life. When Mrs. Brown came into the buffet with Judy, she threw up her hands in horror. "Henry," she said, "what are you doing to that poor bear? He's covered all over with cream and jam." At the sound of Mrs. Brown's voice, Paddington jumped so much he stepped on a patch of strawberry jam and fell over backwards into his saucer of tea. "I think we'd better go before anything else happens," said Mr. Brown, and he quickly led the way out of the buffet. Judy took Paddington's paw and squeezed it. "Come along," she said. "We'll take you home in a taxi. Then you can have a nice hot bath and meet my brother Jonathan." Paddington had never been in a taxi before. He found it very exciting and he stood on a little tip-up seat behind the driver so that he could wave to the people in the street. Soon they pulled up outside a large house with a green front door. When they were indoors, Judy took Paddington up to his room to unpack. "I haven't got very much," said Paddington. "Only some marmalade, and my scrapbook, and a sort of South American penny." He held up a photograph. "And that's my Aunt Lucy. She had it taken just before she went into the home for retired bears." Next, Judy showed Paddington to the bathroom. As soon as he was on his own, he turned on the taps and then climbed onto a stool in order to look out of the window. Then he tried writing his name on the steamy glass with his paw. It took him rather a long time, and when he looked round, he found to his surprise that the bath was so full of water, it was starting to run over the side. He closed his eyes, and holding his nose with one paw, he jumped in. The water was hot, soapy, and very deep, and to his horror he found he couldn't get out. He couldn't even see to turn the taps off. Paddington tried calling out help, at first in a quiet voice, so as not to disturb anyone, and then much louder, "Help! Help!" But still nobody came. Then he had an idea. He took off his hat and began using it to bail out the water. Downstairs, Judy was telling her brother all about Paddington. Suddenly she felt a plop. Looking up, she saw a dark, wet patch on the ceiling. "Paddington," she cried. "He must be in trouble, quick." And together they raced out of the room. Jonathan and Judy leant over the side of the bath and lifted a dripping and very frightened Paddington onto the floor. "What a mess," said Jonathan. "We'd better wipe it up pretty quickly." "Oh, Paddington," said Judy. "What a good job we found you in time. You might have drowned." Paddington sat up. "What a good job I had my hat," he said. Some time later, a beautifully clean Paddington came downstairs. Settling himself down in a small armchair by the fire, he put his paws behind his head and stretched out his toes. It was nice being a bear, especially a bear called Paddington. He had a feeling that life with the Browns was going to be fun. Paddington's garden. One day, Paddington decided to make a list of all the nice things there were about being a bear and living with the Browns at number 32 Windsor Gardens. It was a long list, and he had almost reached the end of the paper when he suddenly realized he'd left out one of the nicest things of all: the garden itself. Paddington liked the Browns' garden. It was quiet and peaceful, and there were times when it might not have been in London at all. But nice gardens usually mean a lot of hard work, and after a day at his office, Mr. Brown often wished it wasn't quite so large. It was Mrs. Brown who first thought of giving Jonathan, Judy, and Paddington a piece, each of their own. "It will keep them out of mischief," she said, "and it will help you at the same time." So Mr. Brown marked out 3 squares, and to make it more exciting, he said he would give a prize to whoever had the best idea. Early next morning, all 3 set to work. Judy thought she would grow some flowers, and Jonathan started to make a paved garden, but Paddington didn't know what to do. Gardening was much harder than it looked, especially with paws, and he soon grew tired of digging. In the end, he decided to do some shopping. He had some savings left over from his pocket money, and he bought a wheelbarrow, a trowel, and a large packet of assorted seeds. It seemed very good value indeed, especially as he still had 2 pence left over. The shopkeeper told him that when planning a new garden, it was a good idea to stand some way away first, in order to picture what it would look like when it was finished. So, taking a jar of his best chunky marmalade, Paddington set out to visit the nearby building site. By the time he got there, it was the middle of the morning, and as the men were all at their tea break, he sat down on a pile of bricks, put the jar of marmalade on a wooden platform for safety, and then peered hopefully towards the Browns' garden. After sitting there for some while, without getting a single idea, Paddington decided to try taking a short walk instead. When he got back, his eyes nearly popped out. A man was emptying the concrete mixer on the very spot where he'd left his jar of chunky marmalade. At that moment, the foreman came round the corner, and seeing the look on Paddington's face, he stopped to ask what was wrong. Paddington pointed to the pile of wet cement. "All my chunks have been buried," he exclaimed hotly. The foreman called his men together. "There's a young bear gentleman here who's lost some very valuable chunks," he said urgently. They set to work clearing the cement. Soon the ground was covered with small piles, but still, there was no sign of Paddington's jar. Suddenly, there was a whirring sound from somewhere overhead, and to Paddington's surprise, a platform landed at his feet. "My marmalade," he exclaimed thankfully. "Your marmalade?" echoed the foreman, staring at the jar. "Did you say marmalade?" "That's right," said Paddington. "I put it there ready for my tea break. It must have been taken up by mistake." It was the foreman's turn to look as if he could hardly believe his eyes. "That special quick-drying cement," he wailed. "It's probably going rock hard already. Ruined by a bear's marmalade. No one will give me 2 pence for it now." Paddington opened his suitcase and felt in the secret compartment. "I will," he said eagerly. Paddington took the lumps of concrete home in his wheelbarrow and worked hard in his garden for the rest of the day. When the builders saw the rockery he had made with the concrete, they were most impressed and gave Paddington several plants to finish it off for the time being, until his seeds started to grow. Paddington's rockery fitted in so well with Jonathan's paved garden and Judy's flower bed. It looked as though the whole thing had been planned. Mr. Brown was so pleased he decided to give them all an extra week's pocket money, and that evening they celebrated by having tea in the new garden. After it was over, Paddington stayed on for a while, in order to finish off his list of all the nice things there were about being a bear and living at number 32 Windsor Gardens. He had one more important item to add: my rockery. Then he signed his name and added his special paw print, just to show it was genuine. Paddington at the circus. One day Paddington was out doing his morning shopping when he came across a very strange-looking man pasting a picture to a wall. It showed a huge tent decorated with red and green and blue lights and streamers, and across the middle were the words, "The greatest show on earth, one night only, book now." When Paddington got home, he hurried indoors to tell the others. "The greatest show on earth," repeated Jonathan, giving Judy a wink. "In a tent, you must have been dreaming." Then Judy announced the good news. It was a circus, and they all had tickets for the front row that very evening. Paddington had never been to a circus before, and he grew more and more excited as the time drew near. The lights were already on when they arrived, and there was a lovely smell of sawdust in the air. It looked very gay and inviting. But the circus itself was even more exciting. There was a band, and a ringmaster in a top hat, and even a lady selling ice creams. Altogether, there was so much to see, Paddington didn't know what to look at first. "I think I would like to join a circus, Mr. Brown," he announced happily. Then he caught sight of the man he had met that morning. He was in the middle of the ring, balancing a bucket on the end of a long pole. "That's a clown," explained Judy. "He's standing on stilts. That's why he looks so tall." Paddington waved, and the man came over and bent down to shake his paw. The bucket tipped, and Paddington jumped up in alarm. Luckily, the bucket was empty, and it was tied to the end of the pole, so Paddington soon got over his fright. Mr. Brown bought him an ice cream, and as the band started to play, they sat back to enjoy the show. All that is, except Paddington. The first act was hardly over when he had yet another shock. Looking up towards the roof of the tent, he saw a man hanging from a rope. "I expect that's one of the popular prices," began Jonathan, looking at the program. "They are trapeze artists." But Paddington didn't stop to listen. "Don't worry, Mr. Price," he called. "I'm coming." Before the others could stop him, Paddington was halfway up the nearest tent pole. He clambered onto a small platform, and then nearly fell off again with surprise when he saw a second man coming towards him. He was dressed in tights and was riding a bicycle. But Paddington was not nearly as surprised as the men themselves. "Look out," shouted the leader. "Hold on." Paddington did as he was told. He grabbed the nearest thing he could see. It came away in his paw, and the next moment he found himself flying through the air. The audience had been clapping before, but when Paddington appeared, they clapped more loudly than ever, for they all thought he was part of the act. He missed the platform on the other side and began to swing backwards and forwards, getting lower and lower, until he came to a stop over the middle of the ring. "Don't let go," shouted the ringmaster. "Whatever you do, don't let go." And then he stopped, and a look of horror came over his face as something soft and white landed on his beautifully brushed top hat. "Crikey," exclaimed Jonathan. "Paddington's ice cream." In the end, it was Paddington's friend, the clown, who saved him. He held up the bucket on the end of his pole so that Paddington could step into it. The cheers as he landed in the ring made the whole tent shake. "Best act I've seen in years," shouted a man near the Browns. More, more? Paddington gave the man a hard stare as he stepped out of the bucket. He'd had quite enough of being a trapeze artist for one night. Even the ringmaster had to admit that Paddington had been the star turn of the evening, and at the end of the show he gave him another ice cream and insisted he took part in the grand parade. "It's a pity we're only here for one night," he said sadly. "I'd like to have you in my circus all the time." "Do you still want to join a circus, Paddington?" asked Judy later that night. Paddington shook his head, and then a faraway look came into his eyes as he tested his sheets carefully to make sure he was safely tucked in. "But it was very nice to be asked," he said. "I don't suppose there are many bears from darkest Peru who can say they've been on a trapeze." Paddington goes shopping. One day, not long after Paddington went to live with the Browns at number 32 Windsor Gardens, Mrs. Brown thought she would take him out shopping. "We're going to the Portobello Road," explained Judy. "It's a big market quite near here." "I should bring your pocket money," added Jonathan. "There's a lot to see." Paddington didn't need asking twice, and soon afterwards they all set off. Suddenly they turned a corner, and he found himself in what seemed like a different world. World of shops and street barrows, gold and silver ornaments, books, old furniture, fruit and vegetables, people. His eyes grew larger and larger as he tried to take it all in. One shop was even having its photograph taken. "That's a new supermarket," explained Judy. "There must be something special on." Paddington's mouth began to water as he peered through the glass. "Perhaps I could do some shopping for you, Mrs. Brown," he said hopefully. Mrs. Brown hesitated. She wasn't at all sure about letting him go off on his own quite so soon, but Jonathan told her not to worry. "Even Paddington can't get lost in a supermarket," he said. "What goes in must come out." "We can meet him by the cash desk on our way back," added Judy. Paddington felt most important as he entered the shop. He lifted his hat to the manager, who was standing just inside the door, and then consulted Mrs. Brown's shopping list. Everywhere he looked there were shelves piled high with packets and tins. There was even one shelf with nothing but marmalade, so he could quite see why it was called a supermarket. His paws were soon full, and he was just beginning to wish he'd left his suitcase at home when he saw the manager coming towards him pushing a large basket on wheels. "May I suggest you have one of these, sir?" he called. "You can take as much as you want now," he continued. "Can I really?" exclaimed Paddington. The manager nodded. "Yes, we like to make our customers happy." Paddington looked most impressed. "In that case," he said, "I think I'll have 2 baskets just to make sure." The more Paddington saw the supermarket, the more he liked it, and he felt sure Mrs. Brown would be pleased when she saw all her free groceries. The other customers looked on in amazement. "Perhaps he's trying to win an eating prize," suggested one lady as he went past, his baskets laden with goods. But the customers weren't the only ones who were watching Paddington with interest. Since he had been in the shop, the manager had been joined by several other important-looking men, and as he reached the cash desk, one of them gave a signal, and they all started to clap. Paddington had never been in a shop where they tried so hard to make their customers happy, and he gave the men a friendly wave as he unloaded his baskets. "Well done," said the lady, handing him a ticket. "I hope you've brought a lorry with you. There's over £50 worth here." Paddington stared at the long roll of paper in his paw. "Over £50 worth," he gasped, hardly able to believe his eyes or his ears. Giving the man who had said he could take as much as he wanted one of his hardest ever stares, he opened his suitcase and peered inside. "But I've only got 3pence. Looking up, Paddington suddenly caught sight of a crowd of people coming towards him. "Watch out," cried the lady as he made a grab for his shopping. But it was too late. With a roar like an express train, the whole lot began to tumble down off the counter. Paddington was still sitting on the floor covered with groceries when the Browns rushed into the shop to see what was going on. All in all, he decided he was much safer where he was for the time being. "You wouldn't think," said the manager, "that giving someone a prize would be so difficult." "A prize?" echoed the Browns. The manager pointed to a large notice on the wall. "This young bear," he said, "happens to be our 1,000th customer today. Perhaps you'd like to tell him he's won a free supply of groceries." "All of which," said Judy, as they staggered home laden with shopping, "only goes to show that bears always fall on their feet." "Even in supermarkets," agreed Jonathan. Paddington sniffed the air happily. "I like the Portobello Road," he said. "I think I shall always do my shopping here from now on." Paddington at the Tower. Soon after, Paddington went to live at number 32 Windsor Gardens. Mr. and Mrs. Brown gave him a basket on wheels. The Browns' house was near the Portobello Road, where there was a large market, and every morning Paddington went there to do his shopping. After calling at the baker's, where he had a standing order for buns, he then went on to see his friend Mr. Gruber, who kept an antique shop. Paddington liked Mr. Gruber's shop. It was so full of things it was like Aladdin's cave. Every day Mr. Gruber made some cocoa, and they had their elevenses together. One morning, however, Paddington had a surprise. When he reached the shop, he found Mr. Gruber busy putting up his shutters. "It's Easter Monday, Mr. Brown," he said. "And as it's such a nice day, I thought I would take you and Jonathan and Judy on a mystery outing." Paddington was very excited. He hurried back home to tell the others, and then he began making some marmalade sandwiches. He soon had so many, he could hardly close the lid of his suitcase. Later that morning, they set off, and Mr. Gruber found them a seat right at the front of the bus, so that he could point out the interesting sights on the way. They had been traveling for quite a while, when Jonathan and Judy suddenly let out a cry. "I know where we're going," said Judy, as they turned a corner. "It's the Tower of London," exclaimed Jonathan. Paddington had never been to the Tower of London before, and he was most impressed. It was much, much bigger than he had pictured. As they reached the entrance, a man in a strange uniform stepped forward to take their tickets. "That's one of the Beefeaters," whispered Jonathan. "They look after the tower." "They're really yeoman warders," explained Judy. "But they get called Beefeaters because in the old days they used to taste all the royal food to make sure it was safe to eat." Paddington raised his hat politely and then opened his suitcase. "Would you like one of my marmalade sandwiches?" he asked. "I expect it will make a nice change from beef." "A marmalade sandwich," spluttered the Beefeater. He held the object up between his thumb and forefinger and stared at it as if he could hardly believe his eyes. But when he looked down again, Paddington had gone. Taking one look at the expression on the man's face, he picked up his suitcase and hurried after the others. Several more sandwiches dropped out on the way, but by then he was much too upset to notice. Mr. Gruber hastily led them through an arch. When they were safely round the corner, he stopped beside a large cage. "This is where they keep the ravens, Mr. Brown," he said. "They've always had ravens here, and it's said that if they ever fly away, then the tower will fall down." Paddington peered at the empty cage. "Perhaps we'd better go soon, Mr. Gruber," he said anxiously. Mr. Gruber laughed. "I don't think there's any fear of it happening just yet, Mr. Brown," he said. "That tower looks very solid to me." He pointed towards a large black bird standing watching them. "Besides, There's at least one raven keeping an eye on things. He looks as if he's got his eye on Paddington, said Judy. Next, Mr. Gruber took them to a room deep under the ground. This is where the crown jewels are kept, whispered Judy. They are made of gold and they are very valuable. That's why they are kept behind glass. Mr. Gruber showed them the St. Edward's crown, the orb and scepter, and an ampulla and spoon for holy oil. They were all used by the Queen at her coronation, he explained. The crown has over 400 precious stones, and it weighs nearly 5 pounds. Paddington's eyes grew larger and larger. He could quite see why no one wanted the tower to fall down. When they came out of the jewel house, Paddington noticed a strange thing. There were now 2 ravens watching him. A moment later 2 more arrived, and all 4 stared at him as he went past. Paddington gave them a hard stare back, but for once it didn't seem to have any effect. Perhaps we'd better have our picnic outside by the river, said Judy, when she saw the worried look on Paddington's face. They won't follow you out there. But the ravens did follow Paddington, and by the time they reached the gate, there were so many he'd nearly lost count. And where do you think you are going with our ravens, young fellow me bear? Asked the beefeater in charge. He's not going anywhere with them, said Jonathan and Judy. They're going with him. It makes no difference, said the man sternly. I'm not letting them leave here and risk having the place fall down. That bear will have to stay in the tower until we've decided what's best. Oh, crikey, groaned Jonathan. Fancy Paddington being sent to the tower. Suddenly, Mr. Gruber had an idea. You know what? He said excitedly. I don't think it's Mr. Brown they're after at all. I think it's his sandwiches. Paddington gazed at Mr. Gruber in astonishment. My sandwiches, he exclaimed hotly. But Mr. Gruber was right. Sure enough, as soon as Paddington opened his suitcase, all the ravens gathered round and began pecking at the contents. All the years I've been here, said the beefeater, and I never knew ravens like marmalade. He looked at Paddington with new respect. Perhaps you could give me your address, sir. Then if any of our birds ever get lost, we can send for you. We may even be able to find you a special jar of marmalade to keep by you in case it's needed in a hurry. Trust Paddington to get sent to the tower and then end up with a jar of marmalade, exclaimed Judy. Paddington looked at it happily. If I'm to be a marmalade eater, he announced, perhaps I'd better test it now just to make sure. Paddington at the seaside. Today, said Mr. Brown at breakfast one bright summer morning, feels like the kind of day for taking a young bear to the seaside. Hands up all those who agree. Jonathan, Judy, and Mrs. Brown all put up their hands, and Paddington raised both of his paws as well, just to make sure. Everyone was very excited, and by the time they set out, the Browns' car was so full of things, there was hardly room to move. Paddington carefully fastened his safety belt, and then peered out of the window as he felt the car turn a corner. Are we nearly there, Mr. Brown? He asked hopefully. Mr. Brown removed a spade handle from his left ear. I'm afraid not, he said gloomily. We've only just left Windsor Gardens, and it's a very long way to the sea. Mr. Brown was right. It was a long journey. But when they reached the seaside, the sight of the sand and the water soon made up for it. Paddington gave an excited sniff as he climbed out of the car. Even the air had a different smell. That's because it's special seaside air, said Mrs. Brown. It's very good for you. Paddington looked round anxiously as Mr. Brown began laying out the beach things. I hope all the air doesn't get used up, Mrs. Brown, he said in a loud voice, and he gave a man who was doing some deep breathing exercises a very hard stare indeed. Come on, Paddington, called Judy. Let's go for a swim. It took Paddington some while to get ready. He wasn't the sort of bear who believed in taking chances, and by the time he went in the sea, he was wearing so many things he promptly sank. "No wonder," cried Judy, as she went to his rescue. "You haven't even bothered to blow up your paw bands." "Fancy wearing a duffel coat," exclaimed Jonathan. "I thought the water might be cold," gasped Paddington. After his paw bands had been properly blown up, Paddington went in the water again, and with some help from Jonathan and Judy, he was soon swimming very well indeed. After his swim, Paddington settled down in a deck chair in order to dry out. He had hardly closed his eyes when he heard something very strange going on behind him. First, there was a loud cry. Then there was the sound of people booing. "They're watching Mr. Briggs punch and Judy," explained Mrs. Brown. Paddington jumped up and looked at the others as if he could hardly believe his ears. But Mr. and Mrs. Brown seemed much too busy with the picnic things to be bothered, so he turned and hurried up the beach towards the spot where the noise was coming from. "Where's Paddington?" asked Jonathan, when he and Judy arrived back shortly afterwards carrying some ice creams. "I hope he's not long," said Judy. "I've got him a special giant cone. He'll be most upset if it all melts." Jonathan glanced up and down the beach. "Crikey," he said suddenly. "Look over there." The Browns gave a gasp as they turned to follow the direction of Jonathan's gaze. Something very odd seemed to be going on inside the punch and Judy tent. There was a large bulge in one side, and it was heaving up and down, almost as if it was alive. Suddenly, the tent began moving across the sand, scattering people in all directions. It just missed a large sand castle, went twice round the ice cream man, and then headed towards the sea. "Quick," shouted Judy. "Let's cut it off." But she was too late. "Paddington," cried Judy, as a familiar figure swam into view. "What on earth are you doing? That's the second time I've had to rescue you." Paddington stared at her in amazement. "But I went to rescue you," he exclaimed. "Mrs. Brown said you were being punched by Mr. Briggs." Mrs. Brown looked at Paddington in astonishment. Then her face cleared. "I didn't say Mr. Briggs was punching Judy," she explained. "I said it was his punch and Judy." "It's a puppet theater," said Judy. "They often have them at the seaside. There's one puppet called Mr. Punch, and when he gets cross, all the audience have to boo." If it took the Browns a long time to explain a Punch and Judy show to Paddington, it took them even longer to explain Paddington to Mr. Briggs. But when he saw the enormous crowd watching them from the promenade, his face lit up. It was the biggest audience he'd had for a long time, and he decided to make the most of it and put another show on there and then. "You can have a seat in the front row," he said to Paddington. "I expect bears do very good boos." One way and another, Paddington enjoyed his day out at the seaside. But all good things come to an end, and when it was time to leave, he stood for a moment holding up an empty marmalade jar. "I'm just collecting some sea air for the journey home," he announced. "I think I shall sleep so well on the way back I may lose all of today's air with my snores."